Humanist Perspective, presented by the New Orleans Secular Humanist Association, following our few principles of humanism.
We're committed to the use of science and reason for understanding the universe and for solving human problems. We're skeptical of untested claims of knowledge, but we're open to new ideas.
We are concerned with securing justice and fairness in society and in ending intolerance and discrimination. We are committed to the total separation of religion and government.
We affirm humanism as a realistic alternative to the theologies of despair and the ideologies of violence. We reject the concept of an afterlife and believe in living a full and rewarding life here and now.
We value and respect each individual's right to judge and lead their lives according to their own position, as long as it's respectful of other people living in a free society.
We hope you enjoy today's program and others in the weeks to follow.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Humanist Perspective. I'm Jim Dugan, your host for this evening. For more information about NOSHA, please visit www.nosha.info. My guest this evening is Mr. Robert Wilfong. He is a resident of the city of New Orleans and has been a history buff for a long time, eventually leading him to take an MA in history. He also lived for many years in Massachusetts, and that's his particular interest. And he's here to talk with us this evening about religion and separation and church and state, especially as they popped up in Massachusetts just after U.S. independence. Robert, thank you for joining me this evening.
Thanks for having me.
So I know that we talked about this a little bit before we got started, and you were particularly interested in the state constitution of old Massachusetts and Article 3. What's that about?
Yeah. Well, and actually the state constitution of old Massachusetts is the same as the state constitution of new Massachusetts. The state constitution of Massachusetts is the oldest written constitution and still in force in the whole world. It has been amended 150 times, but it's still the same basic constitution. The original constitution included Article 3. Article 3 was it's a very important example of fights over church-state relations at the beginning of the American Republic, even before the writing of the U.S. Constitution. After the signing of the Declaration of Independence, the 13 colonies had to become the 13 states, and so they had to write new constitutions. They all did that, but the Massachusetts Constitution was the last of the 13 to be written. I like to think that was because it was the most thoroughly thought out, and it was the most democratically created, and also because it was written primarily by John Adams, the foremost constitutional scholar of his time, and later the second president of the United States. He wrote the whole Constitution except for Article 3. Article 3, we believe it was written by John Adams' cousin, Sam, who you may have had some of. You may have drunk some of his beer, or at least the beer that still contains his name. Yeah.
So this Article 3 is very historic, but it also has some details that today might seem a little bit odd.
It's fascinating. Among other things, Article 3 requires the towns of Massachusetts to hire Protestant ministers, pay them out of local tax money, and to build and maintain churches at public expense. Which today we would just, this is obviously unconstitutional today. But of course this was written 7 or 8 years before the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution.
So now we should be a little bit clear here. We're not talking about the colonial period. We're talking about after independence.
Yes.
But before modern legal frameworks changed some of the interpretations of state constitutions.
It's interesting that the Article 3 is in complete conflict with the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, and yet it was never considered by the U.S. Supreme Court. It was never challenged. It lived side by side with the U.S. Constitution for 40 years. And when it was finally amended out of existence, it was done so in a very democratic manner at the grassroots level, not by a decision handed down from on high by elitist activist judges forcing a religious people to be secular. No, it was all decided democratically on the ground.
Within the state of Massachusetts,
within the state of Massachusetts,
internal political processes,
right,
without judges overseeing this, this thing was eventually whittled down and done away with.
Yes, and not only did the Article 3 provide for what they called the legal support of the public worship of God, it also gave the legislature the power to require church attendance for all Massachusetts inhabitants. So it's amazing.
Let's talk a little bit about those details in there. So tax dollars that people paid into the public treasury went to
local property taxes. So remember this is the New England town meeting system. Each town has its own town meeting, and the town meeting assesses property taxes, local taxes. People pay the taxes, and those go to support the roads, the schools, and the church.
And they might pay to build a church?
And if the church burned down, you would assess people and rebuild the church. Or if the church needed, or if the town grew and you needed a second church, you would do the same thing.
And they paid the minister?
And the minister's salary was paid by the town out of local tax money.
And I think you mentioned the governor and lieutenant governor.
Okay, and this is the other amazing provision. Both the governor and the lieutenant governor had, as qualifications for their office, they had to have both property qualifications and religious qualifications. They had to have a substantial amount of property at the time, 1,000 pounds. I don't know how much that was worth, but it was quite a lot more than you needed simply to vote or to have to be in the legislature. And you had to have a substantial amount of property, which means land, and you also had to take an oath that you believe in the Christian religion.
And how do they define that, the Christian religion? That could be a little bit up for grabs.
Well, now this is, okay, so of course this is going to be a difficult path. You're going to be walking a tightrope. On the one hand, these are the descendants of the Puritans who had fled England because of the monopoly of the Church of England. You know, talk about union of church and state. The head of the English state is the king or the queen, and the head of the Church of England is also the same person. That's about as unified in church and state as you can get. The Puritans didn't want to do that. They wanted to have freedom of religion, but of course their idea of freedom of religion was you're free to be a Christian, you're free to be a Protestant, and if you want to be a Baptist or a Quaker or even a Universalist, okay, we'll let you do that. But you really need to support the church, meaning the Congregational church, the old church of the Puritans.
So your taxes, regardless of your personal denomination, if you had one, your taxes went to the Congregational church.
The Congregational church. Now, Massachusetts considered themselves reasonable. They had this theory that society stands on two legs, the church and the state. They're separate, but they work together. If either leg fails, society will fall. And this is where and of course their idea of the church was the Congregational church. But again, if you wanted to belong to another sect, you were free to do that. And if you had a minister of that sect available to you, you could apply for an exemption from your church taxes, and that money would then be sent to your minister. Now
that's very modern. That's very progressive.
Yes, yeah, and that sounds fair. But let's think about how these things actually work out in real life. I'm Hezekiah Whitcomb. I'm a Baptist farmer out in a small town far from Boston. You're the local town clerk. I come to you and I say, I want to be exempt from the church taxes. And he said, oh, the Baptists have a minister now. I didn't know that. Well, we don't really have a minister. We have a circuit rider who goes to all the small congregations. There's only 3 or 4 families here. And he only gets here about once every 2 months. But he knows that the Spirit is in me, and I'm a good religious teacher. So he's authorizing me to be the minister to this small group of Baptists. And when he comes, he'll take over. So I want the money that we would pay to come to me, and then I will also give it to the circuit rider when he comes. You look at me and say, you just don't want to pay your taxes. You're not a real minister. I mean, the Congregationalists, their idea of a minister was someone who had graduated from Harvard. Mm-hmm. And that was the main purpose of Harvard, was to train ministers, someone who could read Greek and Latin mm-hmm. and Hebrew, could read the Bible in the original languages, and was a learned mm-hmm. Minister, learned preacher. These Baptists are just, they're not real preachers at all. So you would refuse to give me the exemption. I, naturally, would be very upset by this. This is going to cause a lot of hard feelings. And you can say, well, you can appeal this if you want. You can go to Boston. Boston is 40 miles away. It'll take me 3 days to get there. I can't afford to go there. I have animals to feed, and I have crops to tend to, and I have a family. I can't go there, and I'm just not going to pay that part of the tax. Oh, you say, well, we'll see about that. So the next year, I don't pay that part of the tax. You write it down. The year after that, same thing. You write it down again. And it's a small town. Everybody knows everybody else's business. Half the people are related to each other. You know that I have a cow that I've been raising, and when it gets big enough, I'm going to turn it over to the cattle drover, who is going to take it on a cattle drive to Boston, along with all the other cows in the neighborhood, and sell it. And then he'll have a fee, and I'll get the proceeds. So I'm bringing my cow to the drover. And just before I hand it over to the drover, you step up mm-hmm. with your cousin, the sheriff, mm-hmm. and say, Hezekiah Whitcomb, we have a lien here, mm-hmm. judgment against you for non-payment of taxes. We talked about that. Mm-hmm. This is legal. This mm-hmm. is by the law. We're taking the cow, and when it's sold and the drover gets his fee, we're taking your unpaid taxes, and if there's anything left over, you'll get the rest. Mm-hmm. Well, you can imagine how that's going to go over.
And what did they do if you mentioned that if you didn't go to church, this was you could get a fine as well?
One of the first things they did, I wonder if we could get. I've been forgetting to put in the images. Okay. If we could get image number 10.
Which one? What is that one about?
That's the one that shows the law. One of the first laws that they passed after the Constitution went into force. Yeah, there it is. Okay.
There you go.
And I don't know if I can read this clearly from here, but it says, well, it says that all people who are able to must go to church. And if anyone who is able-bodied and could get to church is absent for a month at a time from church, they will be fined 10 shillings. This is one of the laws of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So
now you've mentioned that there were other denominations than the Puritan Congregationalists. There were Baptists, some others, but some things would be considered outside the pale. There were almost no Roman Catholics, for example.
Right. This is one of the most fascinating parts to me of the whole story, is that we sometimes think that the problems today come because of we have such diversity and multiculturalism. Massachusetts between 1780 and 1833 was about as cultural, just the exact opposite of Massachusetts mm-hmm. of today. It was as homogeneous as you can imagine. Not only was everyone, I'd say at least 95% of the people were not only white, Anglo-Saxon, and Protestant, but they were the descendants of a pool of about 20,000 English migrants who came between 1620 and 1640.
Mostly from the same part of England.
And even from the same part of England. Not only were they from England, but they were from an area of southern England east of London called East Anglia. Mm-hmm. That was, for some reason, a hotbed of Puritanism at that time. So this is just about as homogeneous as you can get. So you would think, well, everybody must have been in agreement, everything must have worked out fine. No, this homogeneous population fought like cats and dogs. They fought over infant baptism. They fought over payment of taxes to local ministers. They fought over the Trinity, the Trinitarians.
It's for anybody who's studied American history, Puritans are notorious for their infighting. Things like the formation of the state of Rhode Island by religious dissenters, the Salem witch trials, which can't really be understood completely without understanding internal bitternesses.
I've never understood the Salem witch. I keep trying, but some things are just too hard to understand. But
so you have this very homogeneous group of people, white men. The men are writing all the laws and making all the decisions.
Yep. And voting.
And the only ones who can vote and attend juries and be that sort of thing.
Yep.
And in spite of their homogeneity, they fight a lot over any kind of detail that could possibly generate.
All these questions of religion. The Puritans thought that if they could only come here and establish their city on a hill, where everybody was a Puritan and everybody agreed, basically, that everything would work out fine. And of course, that's not the way. That's not the way humanity works.
And then somehow, without a U.S. Supreme Court looking over them, the people in Massachusetts, that same homogeneous group of people, found that their religious laws, this Article 3, didn't really work the way they expected it to. They had trouble with it.
Absolutely, and eventually, it wasn't just trouble with a few cranky Yankee farmers out in the boondocks, like Hezekiah Whitcomb, but it was a split. There was a split within the Puritan standing order itself.
You probably should explain a little bit about the standing order.
The standing order that's just what the Puritans called their whole social order. And it sounds very very authoritative and very official and very stable. And Connecticut has always called itself the land of steady habits. So you can get some idea of what these people were like. But sometime after 1780, the thinking changed within the standing order, within the Congregational Church, between the old conservatives who were Trinitarians and the new, more liberal people who were Unitarians. And I'm in way over my head on theology.
If I might just theology of this gets a little bit crazy. Unitarians actually reject the concept of the Trinity of God in three persons, which creates a lot of theological problems for Congregationalists who are very, very Trinitarian.
So the Unitarians are, what it comes down to is the Unitarians are denying the divinity of Jesus. They are saying that God is one, Jesus is not God, that he's a man like any other. He's a great prophet, he's a great teacher, he's the founder of the Christian religion, but he is not God. Well, this was anathema to the old conservatives. Oddly enough, at this point when the Unitarians had come to this thinking that God is one and that Jesus is not God, but just a prophet, they had arrived at the point that the Muslims arrived at 1,200 years earlier, that Islam is actually a Unitarian religion, and they stress greatly that Muhammad is not God. He is the prophet of God, and he's tremendous respect and so on, but he's not God. And the Unitarians had come to the same theological position around 1800. Very interesting.
So how did this all start to fall apart?
Gradually, more and more descendants of Puritans became Unitarians. And as they did, they started to drift away from the church. So the people who stayed in the church itself are more and more the conservatives. But by the terms of Article 3, the minister is hired and paid not by the church, but by town meeting. In 1816, the town of Dedham had to hire a new minister. And town meeting, not the church conservatives, but the town meeting hired a Unitarian. The religious conservatives of the church just freaked out. They could not accept this. They were horrified. They're going to leave the church and go start their own church. But when they left the church, they took all the church stuff with them. The church was 180 years old. It had accumulated a lot of valuable stuff. They had communion silver. They had fancy brocades to decorate the pulpit. They had deeds. They had property. They had people had left real estate to the church and bonds and stuff. They took all that with them. The new church, the new minister, Alvin Lamson, says to the religious conservatives, "Hey, where are you going with all our stuff?" "Your stuff? This isn't your stuff. This is ours. My grandfather gave the money to buy this silver. That's not your stuff. It's our stuff." "Oh, is it?" "Oh." And backed by the Unitarian majority of the town meeting, Alvin Lamson took them to court. The case dragged on for 2 years, but eventually they won. And it was decided that all that stuff that the church had belonged to the town, not to the...
Paid for by tax money.
Paid for by tax money. And if somebody wanted to contribute something on top of it, it still is the property of the town.
Very similar battles happen in America every day now when churches split up over ordination of women or admission of gays. And they want to hive off, and who owns that?
Yes, yeah. And so... once that was decided, the writing was on the wall, and the conservatives realized that this system of having the town meeting control things and to use the taxes to support the church, this wasn't going to work anymore, that the church had to be free of the town meeting and had to be able to raise its own money and take care of everything by itself.
So there's this amazing, shocking realization that, stunning, inconceivable, that somehow public funds, tax dollars, it means that somebody outside the church has some kind of control over what...
See, the original thinking was they had assumed that everybody was always going to be an Orthodox Congregationalist, that there would not be any other thinking. They assumed that everybody in the town meeting would, of course, they assumed that society stood on two legs, and that the state would always support the church would always support the state. It turned out that life is much more complicated than that. And so finally, by popular demand, the state legislature rewrote that section of the Constitution, took out the provisions for the legal support of the public worship of God, and put in the provisions that are there today.
So what did they get rid of? They got rid of the requirement for you to go to church.
Yes.
They got rid of the public funding for the minister in the church. And how about the oath of office?
The oath was not a part of Article 3, and they had already gotten rid of that several years earlier.
That had already fallen away.
Now, Massachusetts was not the only state. It may sound like Massachusetts is a religious fanatics here, but actually what they were doing was fairly common at the time. And there are still states today that have religious requirements for public office in their constitutions, although they can no longer be enforced. Louisiana is surrounded by states. Mississippi, Arkansas, and Texas all have, according to Wikipedia, these provisions for religious oaths for public office in their constitutions, but they can no longer be enforced. Okay, well, we're getting close to our time. I would like to say that there is one, although I'm generally encouraged by this story because everything was decided democratically on the ground. There is something that I have found a little unsettling. I believe that anti-atheist prejudice is the last respectable prejudice. And I think it goes very deep, even deeper than just questions of religion. And I see it in the wording of Article 3. And I'd like to read the beginning of the Article 3. It says, "As the happiness of a people and the good order and preservation of civil government essentially depend upon piety, religion, and morality, and as these cannot be generally diffused through a community, but by the institution of the public worship of God and of public instructions in piety, religion, and morality, therefore, to promote the happiness and to secure the good order and preservation of their government," and then they go on and give the provisions. As an atheist, I hear this as saying that somehow I cannot be a good citizen because I do not believe in a religion. I don't go to church and I don't follow any religion. And there's this assumption that somehow religious people are better citizens than irreligious people. I think we have given up the idea that public money should be used to pay the minister's salary. We have given up the idea that people should be forced to go to church. We've given up the idea that people should even have to give an oath of office saying that they believe in the Christian religion. But somehow I don't think we have given up the assumption that religious people are somehow better citizens than people who are not religious. And so that tells me that we need to, that the process of the separation of church and state is not settled once and for all by an amendment to the Constitution or even a court order, but it's a process that goes on, and we should always be paying attention to it. We should always be putting forth our point of view and trying to work for increasing the separation of church and state.
And I think we should clarify that in modern times, we're working within the framework of the 14th Amendment, right?
Yes.
That after the Civil War made the Bill of Rights, made the first amendments to the U.S. Constitution binding on the states.
Right.
So the Equal Protection Clause means, among other things, or courts have interpreted it to mean, among other things, that the Establishment Clause, that Congress shall make no law regarding the establishment of religion, applies to the states. But that was not necessarily the case back in the day, and what you're talking about is before all of that happened, when many states had these kinds of laws and commonly enforced them.
And even so, but even after the 14th Amendment, the people who are interested in some kind of a union of church and state have still managed to put forth proposals. The Christian Amendment, that's another story. Are you familiar with the Christian?
No,
the Christian Amendment. It's a fascinating story, and maybe some other time we can talk about that.
There's a whole other program.
Whole other program, yes. And that takes place completely in the era since the 14th Amendment, yeah.
So, but it's very interesting to compare and contrast some of the modern concepts of separation of church and state, and to see how in a situation before the modern jurisprudence, before the 14th Amendment, how a state that was trying to maintain a certain officialization of religion just walked away from it, from their own internal democratic process, that it just wasn't workable.
Yes, and that's a very inspiring story. Something we should know more about. Yeah, good.
Well, Robert, thank you so much for this very interesting view of American history.
Yeah, that's great.
I have to say, I don't know very much. I've looked at a little bit of the history of Massachusetts or maybe colonial America. Mostly I'm interested in things like the Salem witch trials because I do comparative religion and whatnot.
Okay.
I don't understand a lot of the historical background that you've really investigated, the legal history.
I would love to talk about the Quaker invasion of Massachusetts sometime.
Maybe that's another program.
Which happened just before the Salem witch trials.
Robert Wilfong, thank you so much for joining us this evening. And thank you everyone for watching another episode of The Humanist Perspective.